Hey there, how are you? This is the first roundtable episode of Conscient, and I'm reading from a script, but I'm also going to improvise, like as if I were on live radio where you can't take things back. That's kind of fun. In the background here in Vancouver, you hear some people working on their lawns and so on. So, what you're about to hear is the first roundtable conversation that was recorded on Saturday, March 1st, 2025 in Tiohtià, also known as Montreal. It features a bunch of local artists, activists, and cultural workers, most of who have been on Conscient podcasts in the past. And you can see the links to those episodes in the episode notes. And we, talked about our passions, fears, and dreams as I designed it to be in the format of the roundtables. But it was also a lot of fun to have some playful banter, which is when, you just have this free-flowing conversation. However, this group was pretty serious, I would say, and had a lot of issues on their mind, including art and science. So I keep thinking, does anybody know any art and science jokes? But there was lots of laughter and lots of playfulness about some of the serious issues that we face. It lasted 91 minutes, and I didn't edit a single word. I adjusted levels a little bit, but that was it. So what you'll hear is what we talked about for an hour and a half. And before we start, I listened back, and there were 4 excerpts that I thought would be a good way to whet your appetite, especially this first episode, and set the table, so to speak, for this feast of words. So 4 excerpts. The first is, again, around the topic of art and science, and it's Sophie Weider who observed something quite interesting.
What I think is interesting about making art about a problem that I guess came out through science, because it brings in the audience in a way. It says, it prompts the audience to reflect on themselves as part of this problem or as part of this innovation or whatever it is. And I think that brings in the identity piece that you were talking about, Jimmy, where it's like, even just consuming art is a way of discovering yourself and your identity. But then art that asks you to reflect or perhaps create art that might be engaging or community engaged art does that extra step of, now that you've reflected and seen, okay, wait, I'm part of something bigger than myself. What do I have to say about it, or what do I have to do about it, kind of thing.
Shortly after, Jimmy Ong, who was our host that day with his wife Hannah, responded.
And we're thinking about this art-science relation. And to me, it's always felt clear to me that what art can do for science is to democratize science. It's to make it more accessible. But then what I'm curious about is, what can science do for the arts? Yeah. And I'm kind of stuck there in my own mind. Like, what is it that science can do for artists? And I kind of often approach life through 3 pillars of, beauty, which is art, goodness, which is like morality and ethics, and then truth, which is the role of science, I think. And I always felt that the answer is often that the third one is always the mediator. So when trying to find how to better find that balance between art and science, then we should look to morality and ethics. And when we try to find the balance between what's good and what's true, then it's the role of art to be the mediator, and so on and so forth. So,
and you'll hear at the very end, and I hope you're able to stay until the end, Sophie Weider again talked about the end of the world as we know it, which is something that's always on my mind. It's a topic that I often explore in this podcast. But I loved Sophie's take on it, so here it is.
Yeah, just to quickly respond to your comment about despair of the world as we know it. Obviously, there is a lot of science and information about the direction the world is heading. And I think we can assume that things will go badly before they're again good. But I would like to say that like the end of the world as we know it is not necessarily a bad thing. Like we all know that there are huge systemic problems that are causing the challenges we're facing today. And those things need to be solved. And we need to have a fundamental shift to see them solved. Whether that will happen or whether human race will just fizzle out, who knows? But I'd like to think that change will happen and that it is possible, at least possible, that it could be positive in some way, at least maybe at the end of the day, even if a lot of hardship has to come before then. I don't know if that's hopeful or just sad, but that's my take.
And a few seconds later, Katrin Claessens, one of our guests, talked about artists as midwives. And I found that quite uplifting and a good story to end the episode.
Maybe just to add to what you said about thinking of artists as midwives. You know, not as like death doulas, but like it's not hospice care, it's midwives for something else. And we were talking about change earlier. There was recently a post, it was an artwork that someone had put up after the fires, and I think it was in California, and the sign said, "Forced into a great and terrible change." And the word great there is also interesting because it just means big, right? If we take the that value of it, the meaning of it, of anything, connotation of it being negative, but a great change sometimes.
So you get the idea. There, you'll be able to hear those 4 excerpts in context in a few minutes, which I think will make them come alive, so to speak. And I think it's also a good way to set the mood as we begin. So I want to thank the participants of this roundtable for their generosity, courage, and wisdom. And I think they are really cool to have done that. And if you want to know more about conscient roundtables, I wrote a piece on my Calm Presence Substack called Conscient Roundtables, where I explain the background with Brave New Waves and David Bohm's work and other influences for those who want to know that. And if you want to comment, you can email me, claude@conscient.ca, or go to conscient.ca, and the links are there to the different social media that I use. And of course, if you like something, please share it. You can also do a review, in particular on Apple Podcasts. That's very useful to get these words and thoughts circulating in the community and to create a little bit of buzz. So let's begin. I hope you enjoy Conscient Roundtable, March 1st, 2025, Montreal. Hey guys, welcome. This is the first Conscient Roundtable, so I'm a bit nervous. Thanks for joining me, both you here in the room and the audience at home. I'm going to start in a few seconds with a minute of silence because I think that's a good way to start a conversation. It's something we've been doing in a course I'm taking called Surviving the Future. And so we'll do that in a second. And I'll just, those at home will also have the opportunity to take this moment. One of the things we often do in these, at the beginning of meetings like this, is recognize the traditional custodians of the lands and waters. And I invite everyone to do that. We are here in Tiohtià, which is also known as Montreal, the traditional territory of the Giangahaga, which is a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst First Nations, including the Giangahaga of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, the Abenaki, and the Anishinaabeg peoples, and more recently with settlers. So let's do the minute of silence, and then we'll start talking. Thank you. So since this is the first roundtable, I'll read you what it's supposed to be about. Long duration informal banter with friends and colleagues, that's you guys, about their passion, fears, and dreams, inspired by the innovative ways of the 1980s era CBC radio overnight talk show, Brave New Waves. Participants are invited to tell a good story and to expect to be interrupted and maybe teased once in a while. Roundtable is an engaging kitchen party. Now, we were just in the kitchen here in Jimmy and Hannah's place, but we've congregated in the living room, but the idea is to pretend you're in a kitchen, because kitchen conversations are often fascinating and chaotic. And those who want to know more about the roundtable, I wrote a Substack posting on my A Calm Presence account about it, talking about why am I so sentimental about a radio program, an overnight radio program from, whatever it is, 40 years ago. And I also recently discovered the work of David Baum, who wrote a lot about dialogue and the value of dialogue and an open-ended agenda in dialogue so that it is free and flowing. And I thank artist Devorah Newmark for talking to me about that, and they're coming up, in an episode of Conscient later in season 6. So that's enough blah, blah, blah. We're here to talk about what we're feeling, and I mentioned to those gathered here that I'm really interested in hearing how you really feel, and to talk about your truth, and also to listen to each other. And listeners at home can also enjoy that flow of conversation. Now, I'm going to start with a story, and I'll put my phone down here because I actually remember this. So this is the thing. Last night I had a dream, and Sophie, we were talking about dreams a minute ago. And the dream was that I had been gifted a bundle of arts wisdom. This is something I've experienced before with Indigenous people, where there's bundles as part of rituals and ceremonies. So for some reason, I was given this bundle of artistic wisdom, and I was meant to use it. So there were books and writings and stories and songs. And so I was in my dream, doing it. And then you're meant to give something back, to add to the bundle and then pass it on. So I thought, what an interesting dream. Why did this come up? And then on the train on the way here, I thought, it's you guys. You guys are the artistic wisdom that has come to me. I'm going to cry. That is so beautiful. And then we add to our collective knowledge through this conversation, and then we share it with the world. So that's the story I want to begin with, because it's so fresh. It was last night, and I didn't realize that the connection between the dream and this.
I guess this is the first time that I meet some of you, and some of you I know better, and I know that we all come from different backgrounds, whether it's maybe we started out first in the sciences, or maybe in the arts, and then from science made our way over to the arts, or vice versa. And for me, it was as a visual artist first, and then it sort of was natural that these were the sort of things that I was thinking about with the environment and the sort of crisis that we're living in. But I guess that was what I was thinking about when I was reading the description from everybody who's going to be participating today. And so I guess I'm curious as to how did that happen for you? How did that journey happen, I guess, from the science to the arts, or vice versa? And yeah, so for me, I think the two parts of my life, the sort of science part, or the more sustainability in that side, and then the whole arts side of myself have always been kind of together. Because for me, I feel art is a way to explore the world to like reflect back to yourself and to others what you're seeing and how you're feeling about things. And so that's been true for me in every facet of my life. But then when I started to care a lot about environmental issues and started to feel a lot of eco-anxiety, for me, art was always an outlet for that. So in the work that I do in sustainability, I try to bring in the arts because it really was a gift for me to feel better and to feel like I had a voice. And that really is a gift I want to share to other people. And I'm still trying to find out sort of how to have an impact through art, and that's like a question that I'm still exploring, but the sustainability and the arts for me are very connected in the way I've gone about it.
I'm just going to share what kind of rose in me and resonating from within. And I think in thinking about that connection between art and in thinking about the connection between art and climate change and the world, it feels like to me there's something about identity, the intersection between identity and power. So I see kind of art as that space where they can, the space to generate that connection between the two. In the sense that when I think about the artists that have most inspired me, and I've always been engaged in artists I've always been fascinated and interested by artists that are engaged socially. And I realized that what engaged art does to me is it connects my identity with power. And what I mean by that is it forces me to take something that I find beautiful and connect that with something that has an ethical or moral aspect. And so for me, art is how I connect my identity to my power at the most basic level of things. So, yeah.
I'm tempted to ask you more about that, but I think it'll come back. It's a good question to start with because, why am I doing this? It's partially my learning and my unlearning journey. So the unlearning part is the most important part. It's how can I make space in my mind and what I know for other things to enter, like the whole understanding decolonization. I have to decolonize myself, or at least rework the way that I've been educated. Even though I have a good education, it's not useful for me in these times, right? Mm-hmm. So, and my father's a doctor, my mother's an artist, so a lot of us were brought up with both. And in some ways they're indistinguishable, right? Because you're researching, you're exploring aesthetic experiences, you're trying to figure out, to make sense of life, right? It's what we're doing. It's just art is so cool, right? Because it has so many ways and emotions, and so we created this thing called art. But I'm also concerned now that we've kind of created a silo of art, and separated art from life in sort of Western culture. And so there's lots of things to work through with art, and we all know its power because we've experienced it in many ways, or at least I think we do. But a lot of people would see art as superfluous because it's not essential to life, but it actually is life. To me, art is life, not art in the sense of the art world, but the artistic expression, the stories, the songs, the things that we do. That's what's most meaningful to me, the relationships we have with each other, with nature, but art kind of brings it all together. So I'm an artist who loves art and who's writing a piece called Art is Dead, L'art est mort, vive l'art. Art is dead, live art, because in a way it has to die for it to have a rebirth. Anyway, you ready?
Sure, maybe I can go off of that. I think the thing that came up for me when you were speaking was, at the beginning of the pandemic when everybody kind of collectively decided that artists and art creation was a non-essential service, and everybody just hunkered down and watched a lot of Netflix and listened to a lot of music and consumed a lot of non-essential art to get through that horrifying collective trauma that we all went through together.
the irony of it was fun.
I'll respond to a few things here. One of them would be what you were talking about, art and morality and engaged activism, and how that, responds to you. I think for me, one of the things that I really struggled with in art school was how uncontained it was, how it could be anything. And you're sitting there and you're like, I could make anything about, and you have lecturers encouraging you to just fling yourself out into the furthest parts of uncharted territory, and art that is immoral, art that is violent. And there's a lot of artists working in that way. There's a small national park in South Africa called the Edith Stephens Wetland Park, and it looks terrible. It's got invasive grass, it's got there's nothing pretty about it. It's in the middle of vast informal settlements and poverty, and in this park there is a tiny, I think it's an orchid, it's a little flower that grows, and they've created this park to just keep this tiny little flower. I think it's been around for millions of years. It's the only place in the world where it grows. And one of the rangers, it's so small, I don't know if we could call them a ranger at the park, said was that how when you are living in a very violent environment, and when you are living in deep poverty and there's a lot of stress in your life, and you come across a landscape like the Edith Stephens Wetland Park, it touches something inside you in a way that perhaps a manicured park wouldn't. Something inside you feels broken or insecure, and that landscape speaks to you in that way. And I think it's also important to have art that, we're talking about art being useful, and what if it's not? What if it's frustratingly awful or doesn't do anything? And I find that kind of work annoying myself, but also sometimes surprisingly touching, and can really create a lot of change or challenge me in a way. You come to a work and you feel angry or annoyed, and I don't maybe love it that there would be artists that would be wanting to do that, but I'm glad it's there. I'm really, really grateful for work that also challenges me in that way, for artists that are strange and antisocial, and that's what I just love about art. There's so much of it like that. At the same time, there's also a lot of art right now that can leave you feeling quite cold, or you just look at it, you're like, well, as someone said, it kind of fizzles in an unimportant part of the brain. And then just to respond in a kind of unconnected way to what Claude was saying, I've been reading a lot about Neanderthals and early humans. And one of the things... yeah. Well, it's related to what we were talking about as art, as sterile. And one of these things that just kept coming up in my mind is artist as shaman. What role does art play in healing and creating, in magic, I suppose, in early societies? And looking back at these tiny fragments of bone, you can scraping the smallest bit of DNA, that you can barely touch who these people were, and there's still little fragments of art there. And I just think that's your DNA and a little bit of art, and that's what's there. So, yeah. Love to hear, Alyssa, what your take is.
Yes, well, I guess what you've been saying sort of has me thinking about the pandemic, and art was sort of how I survived the pandemic, actually, now that I think back on it. And at the time, I was at the University of Regina, so very far from here in Saskatchewan, far from my family for the first time as well, far from my family and friends. And I was working in a studio space, in the basement of the university. And so, I was there during this time, and it was incredibly challenging and isolating, and sort of working on the work that I did while I was there is how I got through a very challenging period of time. And ultimately that work was about about home and about like wanting to belong to a place. And I felt so like disconnected from home at the time as well. And even just like walking on the land, that became part of my practice. And I started to see the connection as well of like traveling on the land. And I ended up making these sort of like shelter like structures. And I felt like we all sort of needed a sheltering space during this time. So yeah, that's what that got me thinking about, was sort of like how we can get through things with art, and like moving across the land, and like just walking. Like walking is really healing for me. And that sort of was the time when I realized that was part of my practice as an artist too.
Well, it's interesting to talk about the pandemic, because we obviously all experienced it, not necessarily in home or wherever we were, but this podcast started during the beginning of the COVID podcast pandemic. And a lot of things started during COVID that either have continued or have stopped, right? And one of them was Scale, an organization that I helped found, and it's been hard because people went back to their lives after COVID, and yet they have all this. They had all this time to think about life, right? Mm-hmm. And to experience art, and to experience each other, and to go through difficult relationships, and some people were confined with each other, and that wasn't necessarily the plan. But so I'm hearing a lot of interesting stories about the positive sides of COVID. A lot of people passed away, and that's tragic. But those who survived the pandemic, I think, are a little bit richer for having had an experience of how difficult life is, right? There are many challenges. There will be more pandemics. There's probably small pandemics now as we speak. So I don't know what my point is, other than artists played a really important role in the work that they had created before, but also work that was created during the pandemic, during like songs that were created by. So it's interesting, that canon of work, call it the COVID canon work, that enriched our lives, or at least brought us more aware of our fragility, right?
And also maybe there's something to be said about art that's very didactic. So it says you should feel this way, or it's definitely about, you can speak really easily to something, and it's all answers and telling you what it's about, and leaves so little for what you bring as a person to the work. So I'd always be wary of saying art about climate change or art about that, because I think that art dates really fast, actually, and leaves nothing for the viewer to take in themselves. I think it's really important, and we need to be careful when we're writing about our own art and talking about art, to leave room for not just the time that you're in, but the times that will come as well. And remember that it is open to interpretation. And was the art really about COVID, or was it about chaos? Was it about being confined? Was it about walking? And that will take the art through shelter. I'm so interested by that. Like, when do we need shelter? And maybe it just exposed something that was there already that you could then show to other people.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that art dates quickly, because I feel the same way about science. Like, it's well, I mean, I think about
it can date
like
quickly, or yeah.
Well, I mean,
the scientist is squirming.
Well, what is relevant could very quickly become irrelevant. Like, I think about like papers I wrote in university, and it's like, if something is more than 5 years old, it's like, is this really still recent? And I'm sure that there are things that I wrote 10 years ago that might be like completely cringe, irrelevant now. Yeah. So maybe like art about science is like the ultimate representation of like what is it, like
irrelevant?
Not no, like effervescence, or like sure, yeah, I'm trying adjectives.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
That are like hyper relevant for this period of time, and still not irrelevant after that. Like, but just like a snapshot in this moment in time where this, where like this piece of art was made about this current understanding of the scientific literature, and then like a couple months later,
artifact in a way, an historical artifact rather than something living and breathing. And I know a lot of people say there's no good art and no bad art, but I think that's perhaps where better art comes in, you know, where it's meeting a moment, but also transcending that, or understanding that it's a moment, but it's also a timeless human experience, or maybe not. I don't know, that it speaks to something beyond just one specific thing.
Yeah.
Moment.
And it's like, it's a way of kind of like, it's a way of kind of like solidifying a current understanding of the science in a way that's not a journal article. Journal articles are great too, but art inspired by journal articles is a little more digestible, maybe, for some people.
Thanks. Well, I like that you brought up art science, because it's something that I think is really interesting and I'm currently very fascinated by. And for me, like, what art brings to science is the sort of this way of bringing in different ways of knowing the world. Because science really has like a specific sort of like system of thinking and coming to answers and coming to conclusions and then being like, okay, what are we doing with this? And then art takes all that and is like, okay, so there's a problem here, but there are so many different ways to interpret this problem and so many different possible solutions. And so that's kind of what I think is interesting about making art about a problem that I guess came out through science, because it brings in the audience in a way. It says like, it prompts the audience to reflect on themselves as part of this problem or as part of this innovation or whatever it is. And I think that brings in the identity piece that you were talking about, Jimmy, where it's like, even just consuming art is a way of discovering yourself and your identity. But then art that asks you to reflect or perhaps create art that might be engaging or community engaged art does that extra step of, now that you've reflected and seen, okay, wait, I'm part of something bigger than myself. What do I have to say about it, or what do I have to do about it, kind of thing. Yeah.
I think that's also really interesting, this art science thing that I think all of us, you've mentioned it, I think a lot of us are touching on. One of the things I've seen a lot when artists and science come together, and I think it's unfortunate, is that the art serves the science. They don't always meet. In fact, I think they very rarely meet at the same place. I have seen some examples of when that happens, and when it does, it's chemistry, it's magic, it's wonderful. It's like the best examples of interdisciplinary. It's so exciting to see that, but so often it falls flat. I can think of a couple of examples where people have just taken very literal science, or they've just illustrated it. This is what, like a cartoon, and I'm not sure if that's, I mean, is it, it's a form of art, but is it challenging? You know, no. And I just think that's such a sad thing. And I always I felt really insecure as an artist. So I did, especially when it came to talking about climate change. So I went and did a whole ass like degree in climate change. And when I got to the end of it, I had realized two things. One, I didn't really need to do that degree and my insecurity was misplaced. But the other thing I realized was I always had thought scientists would just poo-poo an artist, but they didn't. They were so excited to know and engage and meet us in that way. So I think there's something in that as well that perhaps relates to what you're saying about when art and science are at their best, they're kind of doing the same thing sometimes. Yeah.
Well, I can give an example of art-science collaboration that might help sort of like illustrate what this could look like if it was done well, I guess. So I've recently been organizing this series of workshops with artists at McGill where they talk about how they engage with ecological themes through their work and how that, in a way, is sort of a science. And so one of our recent speakers, her name is Kelly Jasvak. She's a very cool artist. She's based in Montreal, so you guys should look her up.
I'll put her
information in the episode notes. And she is part of a group called the Synthetic Collective. That's a plastics research group. And something that's really interesting about that is that it's a science or a research group that involves more than just scientists. They also have journalists, they also have artists, and they're all working collaboratively. And she was sort of telling the story about how she ended up working in plastics. And it was actually like through following her curiosities as an artist. And she actually discovered this passion for plastics when she started working with reusing plastics through her work. She realized that they were having negative impacts on her health. And that really made her think, oh, wow, we're actually living in a world that is plastered with material that is killing us. And that made her want to make art about it. But it was sort of like that process of creating through art brought her to those conclusions. And then as being part of this research group, she is a part of that like explorative process, helping to like bring in more community members into the work or bring in a different perspective, as well as doing that science communication bit at the end, because her work is sort of in some ways like telling the story of what's coming up with the research collective. But that's just an example of how it could be done really well. And I think that people do, like you were saying in the pandemic, devalue arts really easily because it feels like unnecessary to people who haven't really had the fortune to be part of it. But I do think that like arts has such a service to provide to the world in so many different ways, beyond just bringing us joy, making us feel fulfilled or understood and all those good emotional things. Like it actually is an amazing way of studying the world, understanding the world, designing our way forward in a positive way, and so many other things that I just wish that people collaborated with artists more, to be honest.
Yeah, I have half an answer and half a question that kind of go together, and we're thinking about this art science relation. And to me, it's always felt clear to me that what art can do for science is to democratize science. It's to make it more accessible. But then what I'm curious about is what can science do for the arts? Yeah. And I'm kind of stuck there in my own mind. Like what is it that science can do for artists? And I kind of often approach life through three pillars of, beauty, which is art, goodness, which is like morality and ethics, and then truth, which is the role of science, I think. And I always felt that the answer is often that the third one is always the mediator. So when trying to find how to better find that balance between art and science, then we should look to morality and ethics. And when we try to find the balance between what's good and what's true, then it's the role of art to be the mediator, and so on and so forth. So I think that's my fundamental way to view this tension, is to always see it as like a trinity, sort of. So if we're trying to figure out a connection between art and science, we ought to look to morality and ethics to find like that more neutral perspective, to really see what is the fair relation between the two, so that one doesn't abuse the other or doesn't sort of create an imbalance. Yeah.
I was going to say that I have the privilege of being the father of a scientist, my daughter Clara, and she is probably cringing now as I speak her name, but I did an episode with her, the last of the previous season, and the title was Science as Story, and the way she interprets science is in an aesthetic way. She does the data, and many of you are scientists, but then there's a whole other element of interpretation and feeling. And I don't want to speak for her here, but that conversation with a young scientist was really informative to me, to break down, especially in younger people who are not so siloed, right? You now people go to university and they take a philosophy course and they take a data course and they're connecting the dots as they need to, because the world needs that kind of broad knowledge, including the ethics that tend not to be there. They're in the very hard sciences in terms of certain things, but the overall morality of what we're doing is really the issue, whether it's in art or in science.
How is morality and How is ethics in a hard how is it a science, ethics? You said it's like a hard science? Or?
Well, of course I misspoke, right? What do I know? What I mean is that especially in the social sciences, there's a lot of ethical checks and balances in terms of abuse, but also in hard science not hard science, but natural sciences where you don't want to do harm when you're doing your research. Just there are basic principles of trying to do good, and even though they're contradicted all the time. Anyway, I'm not an expert about science, even though I was brought up with a lot of science around me, but my life has been a lot about interdisciplinariness, interdisciplinary art when I was in Banff and at the Canada Council and so on. And so I've always felt my way through the world through connections, through how does this relate to that? Not that this is an absolute, nor that an absolute, but they're both imperfect things, but they're connected. And oh, look what's behind there. And then we struggle with words like spirit, but I've always felt those things. And I think that's partially what's so fascinating about becoming an artist and potentially a science as well, is that we have this great capacity to feel and to use our instincts and our senses, all of our senses, to navigate the world. And then we create this thing called art because it's the thing, like it's a way that it comes out, but it's more about an experience of life. And not saying that artists know more than others, but when somebody who chooses an artistic profession or a field often has all of those senses, as you may, and is able to go in and contribute to society through that sensitivity and that awakening and that provocation, right? Anyway, I'm glad we're talking about art and science because it's one of my favorite topics. But it's not, like ha 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 fun, but it is really cool, and maybe it is ha 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 fun. But anyway.
I mean, someone mentioned trauma earlier, and I'm very interested in trauma, collective and intergenerational. And I think that one of the things I've learned a lot about is to interact with trauma less through my intellect and more through my body. And I've really become more aware of the role of my nervous system, of our nervous systems, when interacting with the world and the traumatic things that are happening. And it does feel to me that if art is so much about our emotions, then perhaps it's also a way to sort of strengthen our nervous system. Because I think the truth is that we won't be able to solve any of the problems out there if we're emotionally overwhelmed. And we need to do better at helping people reach a space where they feel safe and where they feel that they have bandwidth, and that without that, you can give all the data, all the facts, all the science, but I think people won't be able to engage. And I think the sequence is very important. You need to first make people feel safe through the role that art has in regulating emotions, and then you can bring in the ethical concern, the look what's happening, like feel your feelings now. And then you bring the science, the methodology of what can we do that actually works, that has proven that is effective, and that we're not just doing it so that we feel like we're doing something, but that actually has impact. So I think there's a partnership that has to be better understood, and that comes through understanding the equal value that each bring. Again, in my worldview of art, morality or ethics, and then science. So yeah, just a thought.
I mean, I find that so interesting as well to think about like the feeling of first like being sort of like in a safe space, because I mean like even just through talking with people in different regions of Canada this summer, like I was working on a research project about environmental sustainability from an arts funding perspective, and I mean like the conversations were so different between the people that I had that were in different regions. Like for example, like in Quebec we're lucky because it's part of culture. It's like not taboo to speak about environmental sustainability as much as like say that you're in
a western part of Canada, it's sometimes people feel uncomfortable, and it can be polarizing to, like, certain words can sort of be triggering to, and sort of like be polarizing to different people. So that's sort of what that got me thinking about with that. Yeah, I'm just like also thinking about like the idea of like shelter and safe spaces, and I do think that that connects to some of like the conversations and the things that have been said so far, with like how art also gives a voice to a lot of people who, and it's sort of like another way of discovering the world or moving through things, or just sort of I guess like creating new things and like sort of being in that space, if that makes sense.
Okay, sure. I like what you said about like the polarization aspect that sometimes like bringing up environmental themes can be. And I do have hope in a way, maybe, that starting these conversations through art, or even just like a more kind of like open-minded sense, can really help bring those people in for whom they're like, okay, climate change is not part of my reality, or perhaps even threatens the idea of my reality, to help those people feel like they can be part of the conversation in a way. And I have an example that might make this idea make more sense. I recently spoke with a woman who runs this organization called the Caravan Theaters in like rural BC. And it's kind of like modern day version of like a traveling theater. Like picture a little horse buggy, then they like stop in small towns and they like give their stories and people pay them. They throw pennies at them and stuff. It's like that, but modern day today. And she was talking about how, as an organization, they have a very strong like environmental theme. They have this like a few acres or a large number of acres of land that is owned by the organization, because I guess it was purchased a long time ago. The organization's really old, and they're all about like fostering that land and the connection with the land. And as an organization, they care about a lot about environmental themes. But the place that they're based in is a small town in BC where a lot of people are employed by big farming, by the oil industry, or by forestry, or other resource extraction. And climate change is not part of the conversation there at all, nor any sort of idea of sustainability. And so she was telling me about how they're sort of trying to like gently invite people into those conversations by making it basically like fun and engaging and interesting in a new way. And so she's kind of telling me about how they're like subtly putting in environmental messaging for this like community of people for whom they would hate to have that conversation, and that she does sort of have hope that it is like slowly but surely changing people's mindsets or making them ponder in a positive way. So that could just be an example of how like perhaps we could invite people in a more welcoming sense through art or some other sort of form of conversation, rather than be like, climate change is happening, the oil industry is horrible, you should quit your job. Like, obviously for a lot of people that's not their reality, and that's an accusatory and threatening thing to say. So yeah.
That was such a great example of this. And I think what I was also interested in hearing after what you said, Jimmy, was, we have this, there's collective trauma, there's intergenerational trauma. What are your ideas about how we should move on this? Or like, it can't really put every single person in therapy. We don't have enough therapists for that. Some people might be resistant to that even. Is that actually the solution? That's a very Western way of approaching things as well. I'd love to hear your ideas about, what that could look like.
All right. I think it's a core collective blind spot that we have in our society, not looking at our traumas. At the same time, I think that what the Western approach is talk therapy often. It's like we'll talk about it, we'll reframe it intellectually, we'll create a different interpretation, and that I think is important, but I think it's at best half the work. I think it's probably more likely a third of the work, and I think 1/3 of it is going back to the somatic experience that we have, recognizing that our body interacts with this trauma in ways that we can't always intellectually sort of sense, and it does it fundamentally for intelligent reasons. Like, it's if something harms us at one point or has harmed our family, we ought to track it and anticipate it ever happening again to us. But I think that the problem is we live in an age now where our senses are stimulated by disasters and tragedies happening around the world, and we're seeing it in high definition with our eyes and in our ears. And I'm not sure our nervous system is totally aware that, hey, this is happening 6,000 miles away and it happened 3 months ago, but I'm learning about it now. So my nervous system is completely shut down by the weight of what's happened somewhere else in the world. And then I flip through my phone and it's another thing happening. So I think we need to build that capacity to reground ourselves in our nervous system. And I think that art is a way to meditate on these experiences. And I think another aspect is the big F word, and then it's not the one you're thinking about. Yeah.
Art is thinking.
And what the F word I'm referencing to is family. I think that.
That's totally what I was thinking of. Yeah.
I think that the first place we need to do trauma work is within our own families, within our relationships, often with our parents or with our siblings or with a relative. And I think there's often things there that just end up being projected unconsciously in how we relate to other things. And I mean, you just need to look at some of the world leaders today out there to figure out that they've had some issues they never addressed. So I mean, as a kind of unstructured answer, I think that I really do think that that's a big part of where attention needs to go, but we ought to be empathetic towards people's capacity to do it, and it has to be less about the result but more about the process. And it is one of those things that if we all shifted just a little bit more into doing that kind of work, we would collectively benefit a lot, I think. And going back to what Sophie said, I really love your example as well. And what it made me think of is the idea that I mean, what I got from it is that shifting is meaningful, and shifting is a form of change. And what I mean by that is, like, when does something change? When is it that we can tell that someone who is triggered by the term sustainable development, when can we say that they're no longer triggered by it? Is it when they completely are adopting it, or is it when they're just less hostile to it? And that's where I think we need to celebrate shift, not just change. Which means if someone only moves slightly more towards change, we need to celebrate that and not just wait until there's this measurable, transformative change. We need to celebrate the small shifts, and that is where I think art works very subtly, very privately, and in ways that often are more like planting a seed, where you're building the potential. So from a metrics mind, you don't see change, but if you look with your heart, you see shifts. So yeah.
That's very beautiful. It's almost like a poem. We've been at this for 46 minutes, and I'm very excited about the discourse. And I was thinking about how I, for instance, learn, and it's often by listening, and I retain emotional bursts from people's what they say. I can't remember everything everybody says, but I remember you're talking about housing because I made a mental image of what you were talking about when you were saying it, and that entered my memory and will stay with me. It's like the story became visualized in my. And I think we just underestimate the power of listening to stories and these kinds of conversations where we're not trying to educate each other or convince each other of everything. We're sharing, experiences. And Jimmy's thoughts around trauma just made me think about, traumas that are repressed in me. My father was an alcoholic. These things, not necessarily the right place to talk about it, but when they're spoken, either when you speak your truth and you're able to have it be received by sympathetic humans or more than humans, then it's out there, and you've externalized it a bit. But also the reception of just hearing somebody talk about something like that, somehow my body, my experience gets a little bit, brings us back to this Brave New Wave things, because when I was, 20, whatever, something, I would listen to radio and I would just be totally enthralled by somebody talking about something that I've experienced or that I'm interested in. And all it does is, like you say, trigger a little bit, shift a little bit the perception. And I'm not saying that dialogue is art, though I am saying that dialogue is art. But it's just something about conversation, and that's why I do podcasts, and it's through sound, right? And because the tone of voice, the silence, the emotion that comes through voice, and that's why I like the interruption thing also, because then it's very dynamic. You're feeling the other person's thoughts, like feeling in the sense of connecting to them. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Anybody else want to say something?
Moving maybe to something different, but I think what Jimmy was saying about our nervous systems, and you mentioned scrolling and being on our phones. Someone called their phone the other day like my black misery rectangle or something like that. And with the new, Trump, are we calling it a regime or whatever it is? I've made a decision this time to not interact with the media around him in the same way I did last time, which was to watch it obsessively, compulsively, and really freaking out the whole time. I'm not choosing not to understand what's happening, but anyway. I think, and we're looking right now at Mark Zuckerberg and large media houses. I've been thinking about dark patterns, which seem to come up every time I use an app, which a lot of artists use, if not everyone here, which is Instagram. I'm thinking back to my first exhibition, let's think 2008 or 9. To get people to go there, the gallery had a mailing list of addresses, not an email mail. I didn't have an email address at that stage. I was a little bit of a Luddite, but not a lot of people didn't. We printed things and then we posted them to people. And then we had posters that we printed, otherwise people wouldn't know. Instagram changed a lot of that. We're talking about how does art reach you, all of that. And I'm feeling, when I look at this thing which used to be quite useful, even Facebook, where you'd make an event and people would come. I mean, I don't think anyone has seen a Facebook event in years. You've probably all left it already, and a lot of people are leaving Instagram for another platform, Blue Sky, which has exactly the same incentives as these other ones that we've been using. They're going to have advertising. They're going to want you to do things that you might not consciously want to do. So I'm really interested in hearing people's thoughts on what feels to me like the fall of Instagram, because it was a place to discover art. Art's not, you might see a mural, you might have a book, but how are we seeing art? If we wanted to start regulating people, where are we seeing it? And for me, it was online, and I'm feeling sad about that. I'm feeling sad about this thing that was used to reach people and was also to see art. I'd open up my feed and I'd see art, and I open up my feed and I see, junk, and a lot of violent junk as well.
Yeah, I just have to strongly agree on that. I feel like as a creative person, you feel like you have to put yourself out online. I guess if you're doing it professionally, it's super important for people to know your name and to get the word out there. But for me, I'm like, my art is like a hobby thing, but I still kind of feel like I want to have like a presence on social media just so that I'm not just doing it in my own silo, But I also agree that it doesn't feel super positive to engage through Instagram specifically. And you're right, it's because there's so many distractions on there that are not they're not to serve the users. It isn't, a kind act of having this app and continuing to provide that as a service. They're making money off of it. And yeah, I don't know if there's a way that we could solve that as a problem, but I think a lot of people feel the same way, where it's you have to use Instagram because you want to get the word out, and that's where people are, but it's not it doesn't feel very truthful to you, or you end up in these experiences that are kind of negative, and that almost like takes away the magic of art, like when you're posting it and then you're like, okay, now it's just another cube on a page full of cubes of pictures. And yeah, I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, those are great points. I mean, the two words that came to my mind is analog is the revolution. You know, and I think when we were doing things by print and by mailing physically, it felt like a revolution to have like the internet. I could just press one button and like 1,000 people reach it. I don't need to print it. It's ecological. We save on paper. But now we're realizing that with the algorithms and with who controls it and with the capitalism behind it, it's actually not that great, perhaps. And that what we need to do is maybe shift back to a more analog model. And obviously not analog to the point of writing cards and sending them by mail, but perhaps email is the new analog. And what I mean by that is, I think what social media has done is has made connection very easily, but at the detriment of relationships. And so we think that, I have like 1,000 more followers. I do not have 1,000 more relationships though, because the time I spend to get that 1,000 extra connections, I may have lost 5 relationships. And so we're more relationship poor than ever, though we're more connection rich than ever. And we have to make a decision in terms of our values of what do we want to prioritize. Do we want to have more connections? Or do we want to have more relationships, or at least better relationships? And that's where I think we have to go back to the fundamental truth, which is that a relationship is earned. And if you didn't do something to earn that connection, it's just a connection. And that's where, for an example very practically, is you can pay Instagram or Facebook to have your thing boosted and appear on other people's like social media. But if you want people's emails or phone numbers, generally you need to talk to them. You need to engage with people and say, hey, can I have your contact information? And then I'll write to you and I'll send you something that directly from me. And I think that's what we need to reintegrate in our practice, that we've kind of outsourced that to technology, and that has dehumanized our relationships, and we need to recenter it around how we engage with each other. So, yeah.
I mean, I do feel like, I guess, our phones are sort of like eating chips, I guess. You know, it's sort of like an addicting thing. And you may not be able to hear this, but everybody's crunching on chips right now. But I do feel that. And I mean, like, even just like in my own experience, I try not to go too much on my phone. It's hard sometimes. But I mean, I think it's so important to, like, as you were saying, you're right, like just be with people in person and talk and sort of connect, because I guess like even just being on Zoom all the time as well, still, like, you know, we still get that like Zoom fatigue, and it's just, there's something about being together in person and actually being in the world and going outside and like seeing the city, and so I think there's that as well. But I mean, I was also thinking about sort of what you were saying earlier with like the Trump like regime, as you were saying, and that was a topic that came up at a conference that I was at last weekend, during which I also saw Annette Hegel from Scale, and it's so the conference is Folk Music International, and it's a music showcase event, and there was like a few speakers and sort of like events and sort of like industry events, or like sessions where people would be interviewed, and that was one of the topics that came up, was sort of like how culture is now being threatened and sort of like being silenced in some ways, and that I find it like incredibly worrying. And it also sort of like was interesting to see Canada in contrast to the US, because it is a very US event. So there was a lot of Americans as well. And even just they were talking about that as well, and the sort of worry that they have. And so even just like seeing Canada in relation to the US as well in that context was interesting. And that sort of made me think about that. So
yeah, folks are talking about like being connected to people online versus connected in person, and I feel like I'm both seeing and experiencing this like huge loneliness epidemic that we're all going through, especially like younger generations who are, everybody's hyper connected online. We have these like really kind of like, I guess, seemingly deep like parasocial relationships. Everybody is like you know, feels like they are best friends with Taylor Swift, but then like don't even know their own neighbors. And it's really heartbreaking for me. And I like I've so been trying to cultivate these connections that aren't even necessarily like you know, set social time, but like just connecting with people in day to day and interacting with strangers on the street, and helping friends with daily tasks. And like I'm really craving those kinds of like that like real community feeling. And you know, bringing it back to climate change and disasters, it's like that community is like the ultimate antidote to or like the ultimate I guess strategy or safeguard against like experiencing the worst impacts of disasters. And I really worry that, you know, when a disaster strikes really close to home, which, you know, there have been, but, you know, something in like Montreal where I live, I think about like, who is my community that I like don't have to connect with on social media or text? Like, who is like, I have, you know, I call them like my cup of sugar neighbors. Like I've been trying to like connect more with my neighbors, and it's like such a joy for me in my adult life. I haven't had this a lot, to have neighbors who I can go over and say like, oh, do you have, you know, for example, a cup of sugar, or can you help me with this? Or you know, they text me all the time and they're like, can you put this like package inside that just arrived, or whatever. That's like something I cherish so much, is just those, even though a lot of our interactions are sometimes mundane, it's just like, you know, these are my neighbors. We share a community. We share a street. Sometimes a cup of sugar.
I really like what you were saying about community sort of being resilience in a way. And bringing it back to art, for me, what I think that a very powerful thing that art can do is bring people together and help us realize that we are sort of part of a whole. Because to me, like, the problem that is leading to climate change, but also the problem of us not being prepared for it, is the fact that we are so disconnected from one another and also the world around us, whether it be like our human and our non-human community kind of thing. And like, to me, art is like such a beautiful way of like connecting with people around you. But I mean, it really can be as simple as just like talking to your neighbors. But it kind of like, yeah, the idea of like building community makes me feel so much more hopeful, because it's like, if anything's gonna go wrong, I know I have my people. And I think there is a lot of people right now who don't feel that way, and I don't know, I feel like art could have a role in like helping those people out in some way. And yeah, bringing it back to like the online versus in person, like I do really think it's important to have like community arts gatherings, because like, as much as it's amazing that we can experience art from all around the world and have this inspiration and also sort of like global context that we get through like taking things in online, there's also so much importance in having community that is like local and fostering that through art. I think it's really beautiful.
Oh no, I was gonna pass it to you.
Well, you guys have said what I was going to say, which I'm happy I don't have to repeat it. Picking up on technology, I'm 65, so I started doing electronic music with tape. There were synthesizers, but there wasn't digital. Digital arrived when in my 20s. So the change that we've gone through is extraordinarily fast, and so we haven't had time to develop the ethical systems. It's been co-opted by the corporate machine and capitalism. We know those things, and we have some choices, but not really. My life is my phone. Most of us live that way in terms of finance and so on. So we're in a pickle because we're highly dependent on external forces. So that's something we need to change. Not sure how, but we will. The local thing really comes back again and again, and I've been thinking about it. The interview that's right before this one in the series is with Robert R. James, who's a museums scholar and director from Calgary, or he lives in Canmore. And he talks a lot about permaculture, and he's started a farm on Denman Island, and he's trying to live locally through farming and connection to neighbors, because when push comes to shove, let's say all these electronic systems are dysfunctional, all we'll have is that sense of community and who we know and who we can cohabit with and figure out how to eat and more regionally. And I think that's okay. It's always been like that to a certain extent, because you eat what's around you. Why wouldn't you? Why would I eat a mango from the other side of the world when I can have frozen strawberries from this summer, that kind of thing, you know? So I think we're going that way. That the difficulty I have is I've had an incredibly privileged life. Like I'm a baby boomer. I've had it all, you know, in terms of wealth. And how can we, the future generations, not just you guys, but your children, their children, have good quality lives when we know we'll have less resource around the world, just because of the way some of it can be renewed and regenerated, and some of it cannot. And it keeps me up at night. It makes me sad to think about the future of people who will not have enough to eat or have safety or the things that I've enjoyed. And I really appreciate, Sophie, when you talk about art that way. Now they know you're Sophie. For listeners, we decided not to do names, but you're going to figure out who's who after a while. There's Devin, there's Katrine, and there's Jimmy. But I really love that when you talk about how art can play, and not an instrumental role, an instrumentalized role in the sense of something, but something fundamental to bringing us together around a story, around an artistic experience. And it might or might not be in a gallery, it might or might not be in a theater, it could well be in the streets, it could be, there's an artist here in Montreal, Asma Khan, who talked to me about in Pakistan when there were the big floods where a third of the country was devastated. Art was very active. There was a lot of art being created because people felt a sense of loss, a sense of need to express themselves, to experience. It comes back to trauma. That's a type of environmental trauma that Jimmy was talking about, trauma in other ways. But so I really like that, and I'd love for that to become clearer over the years. Because the debates about art often have to do with funding and professionalization, and I get that. We've created a beautiful system where artists can make a living by creating art. But in the end, when there might not be that infrastructure, everyone's going to be an artist. Everyone is an artist, in my mind, in the sense that we're all capable of telling stories, and some are better at drawing than others, and there are skill levels, but ultimately we all have that capacity to be creative and I'm not denigrating professional artists. Au contraire, I'm saying we need the full spectrum, and I just wonder what will happen to us when some of our system starts failing. What will we replace them with? What will we do that will give us rich lives, regionally, nationally, and internationally? And I believe it's possible. I just can't see it yet, because I'm stuck in the trauma of collapse, which has been a rabbit hole I fell into, and pulling out of it. But it's really hard because you look at the science, you go, wow, science doesn't look good. And yet you look at the capacity of humans and the relationship of humans with more than humans, and then things come alive, my friends. Life is extremely vital and resilient. And so it's like framing it. It's like, it's not just a shift. Sometimes it's a massive shift. I'm pontificating here. I'll stop. Somebody want to jump in?
You're talking about collapse, and this is something we've spoken about together before, but one of the things I'm seeing with this Trump presidency that I think Naomi Klein spoke about in the shock doctrine, and I think which has happened with climate change too, is it's called shock and awe, I think. They bombard you with so much that you're sitting there with your nervous system in shreds, totally overwhelmed, but the magic trick is happening somewhere else. As well as an artist, I work in climate change communications and have worked with people who've worked in the oil and gas industry here in Canada. And what I realized is we are way outfunded, and they are planning 20, 30, 40 years into the future with their communication strategy. I feel like the exact thing happened there. Like, we were all going, climate change is real. Like, let's believe climate change is real. We were on that. They were way ahead of us. And the despair and the resignation that a lot of people feel about climate change now is the point. I don't think that came out of climate change just being a terrible, sad thing. That was, I think, by design. Yeah. They are winning when you're sitting. Yeah, you're sucked into it. It doesn't come from nowhere. I know it sounds paranoid, but read a little bit more into how sophisticated their campaigns are, and actually working with people who did like that and seeing the timelines they were working on and the planning, and they know they are doing surveys, they are doing research. And when you sit at home and throw up your hands and go, there's nothing to be done, they've won. And the same thing with Trump right now. Shock and awe, how it's reported, how you read about it, climate grief, how we feel about it. We're all sitting there twiddling our thumbs at home. The planet is not dead yet. And we're doing everyone a huge disservice when we, and I'm in two minds about this, so I'm going to say this and I'm going to take it back, wallow in climate grief. It's important to feel what we're feeling, but we also need to know feelings don't come from nowhere. Even the feelings we feel in our body often come from a thought. Maybe we can't quite catch that thought, but it's there, and those thoughts need to be challenged, you know? I don't know if any of you have met someone who will drop something and go, oh, I'm so stupid, you know, or, oh, I'm clumsy or something, and you can see they feel a bit stressed in their body. Where does that thought come from? Where do those words come from? Maybe you stub your toe and you have an emotional thing to that, but do you react in anger, or do you kind of laugh a little bit? Or I think there's thoughts there that are happening. It's not just grief out of nowhere. And I think it's really important to realize that there's large-scale manipulation going on. And right now, a lot of us are playing right into their hands, and I include myself in that.
And what's the way out?
Organizing.
Sebastian knows a lot about this. He helped me out of it.
Yeah. To give some numbers, I love numbers. This manipulation that's been going on for like 20 years or something, 14. About climate change and a few other issues, but just for climate change, we're talking about $1 billion every year invested by a few industries, fossil fuel companies, railroads, and a few others. And they're organized. They have a plan. And they want to deny the science when science is a bit harder to deny now. They want us to feel despair, so that we are apathetic and don't organize. But we can organize. And I feel like there is a huge missed opportunity with artists and creatives, communicators of all kinds, to organize and see this issue for what it is. It is a manipulation of culture. Mm-hmm. Culture can be manipulated, and artists affect this culture, of course, but they do this in a fairly disorganized way. There's no methodology. There is no large-scale collaboration. And this could happen. We need to reshape this culture because they have made it a political, polarizing issue, right? It wasn't. They made it this way. So we need to collaborate. We need to create networks. We create effective messaging. And we can't do this on our own. We can't just focus on resilience. We talk a lot about resilience, like we are accepting our fate, but our fate is still being determined. The difference between a world of 2 degrees of warming and 3 degrees of warming is considerable, and this is not settled yet. So there's still time to influence this culture, create story, disassemble their lies, show them for what they are. And then we have a chance to create new policies to exploit everyone's energy. I mean that in a positive way. People want to help. They want to have food on their table. They want safety for themselves, for their loved ones. This is the natural inclination of most people. And we can tap into that energy. There's millions of people who are ready to do the work if we just explain what happened. And I'm expecting a lot from artists and creative people to make that happen, because engineers suck. I'm one of those.
Well, speaking of engineers, there's a conference at the University of Ottawa in early May organized by Chantal Leroudier about art-science collaborations and engineers working with scientists, and that's not a new idea. It's been in the air for a while. But what I am seeing is that earlier today I did an interview with somebody from a group here in Montreal called Éclore. Leah is her first name. I can't remember her last name right now. They're wonderful, and they're a group of 7 women who are engaging people through joy and connection and conversation like we're having today. And it's extremely powerful. It's more powerful than you can imagine, because when people who feel disconnected, who feel dispossessed, and all these words, when they get together and genuinely can feel a sense of possibility and collaboration, whether it's art, science, no matter, just working together, I think there are ways for not just artists, but cultural workers, anybody who has an understanding of how we're being manipulated, and then turning in other directions, and those people, those networks start. Now, ironically, some of that connection is going to be done through technology, through Facebook and whatever. So we have to live with that kind of contradiction. But I've gone old school. I'm using a lot of email now to connect to people, and I do this Substack because I read other people's Substacks. And those are small corporations that have been more upfront about their ethics and their small businesses. And so I'm seeing Blue Skies is an alternative. It's a bit better than the others. So we have to make choices and develop our own networks, our own way of connecting to each other. And this is one of them. Like a living room where we will not be unmoved by what we heard today, by that sense of that need of connection. Then we go back home and we do the work that we do, and sometimes we change our work. We say, well, maybe I don't want to do this job. That's why I retired early from when I worked at Canada Council. I felt I was going to be more effective outside of an institution with the freedom I have as a citizen to do these kinds of podcasts and to be as bold as necessary, but with a bit of calm, because the panic doesn't help that much. It's good to express it. If you panic, then you need support. But then if you actually believe in the possibility of change, and that word change is used all the time. And I can see Jimmy wants to jump in here. All I'm saying is that let's not underestimate the power of conversation, the power of small groups working regionally who are then connected to larger entities around the world, and all of those voices working together can, especially for instance, I was on the way here, I was reading that there's going to be a boycott of Meta products, Meta, Facebook, Instagram, from May 5th to May 11th, 2025. I said, yay, and where did I learn it? On Meta. But that's cool.
And that won't do anything.
But it helps make a gesture. It's like, I'm going to spend a week without. What does it feel like to not be doing that? What if I did it for a month? What if I did it for a year? I think you have to start somewhere, and disentangle ourselves with and understand what the technology is controlling and what it's doing to us in terms of dopamine and all that. The science is there. We're starting to understand it. We have to make decisions individually and collectively about what we want to do with our lives. And I love my phone, and I'm going to try to work with it differently, to not have it drive me, for it to be just a tool like other tools. I use a rake.
I actually want to step back a few
Kilometers?
Yeah, a few kilometers back when I think I resonate with something that Devin shared around her experience with her neighbors, and I think it's been one of my highlights too. And I've been kind of just reflecting on it as we kept the conversation going, and I'm still stuck on it. So I'm trying to unpack it here with you guys, and where I'm at now is I feel like we need to build social skills. And
what do you mean, not interrupting?
We need to build social skills in the sense that I think what I get from that connection with my neighbors is what I was thinking about it is a profound experience of interdependence. And I think what's interesting about interdependence is that if you only have half of it, it completely changes the dynamic. So what I mean by half of it is if I feel that someone depends on me, but that I don't depend on them, it makes me a bit stressed and anxious, and then if it's the other way around, if I depend on someone and I know that they don't depend on me, it makes me also feel like vulnerable. And I think interdependence is the sweet spot where when we're connected with someone and we both feel that interdependence, I think there's something very strong that gets in that bond, and I suspect that the core to solving the most complex collective global issues has to start with our capacity to build that healthy interdependence at the most local level possible. Which is to say that if upon reflecting on how interdependent we are with people in our society, if we come to the conclusion that we don't know the names of our neighbors or that we barely engage with them, I think we should take responsibility for that and recognize that whether it's because we live in a 9-to-5 stressful framework that makes it so that we're so tired when we get home that we just want to go home and sit on a couch and not connect and talk to anyone else, or whatever it is, but that if in practice we're not even able to cultivate that healthy interdependence with the 5 people that we live next to, then how the heck are we going to do that and scale that at a societal level and try to transform systems and oppressive structures? So I think that to me there's something both empowering about this, because it means that maybe the first and most important step is actually all on me to initiate those connections, and that if we all did that, then collectively there would be quite a shift. And then this is where I want to bring arts as well. I think that it's almost as if we did the same thing with arts. We haven't really thought about how do we fit art in neighborhoods between neighbors. A lot of it is we do it professionally. We will have a cultural center or a museum or art space, and then people will go there. It's like a building, and they will come approach. But instead, it has to be build it well where people are, or even better, have people build it with each other. And so my dream is really about how do we bring art into neighborhoods, and how do we bring art as the excuse for neighbors to create together and to connect with each other. And I would love to see more public funding of arts go into that direction. And here in NDG, we have a great festival every year called Porch Fest, where any neighbor has any talent, musical or anything, there's a whole day where we dedicate to it, and people just perform on their porches, and people walk around the neighborhood, and it's great, and it's a great way to connect with neighbors. So yeah.
I mean, that got me thinking about so many things. And I guess, like, I'm even just thinking about, like, back to the pandemic. And I feel like it's been so many years now, but it also feels like it hasn't. And how that maybe, like, has made us realize on, like, more of, like, a society level how we need each other. And, like, not being able to be with each other, like, that sort of how that made us realize that we really really do need to see each other, to be around each other, and to have like those conversations like what we're having today. Like we really do need that. And also not only how we're like dependent on each other, but also to like so many things beyond ourselves, like how we are the food that we eat, how we are dependent on the earth as well, and sort of like those broken relationships, I guess, if that makes sense. So that's just kind of got me thinking on more of like a bigger level, I guess, like sort of, but that's what that made me think of.
I like what you're saying about community art or local art. In Canada and around the world, there are many traditions of community-engaged arts that are a co-creative kind of process, and I always thought it was cool. And at Canada Council, I had to hold back a bit, but now that I'm not there anymore, I think it's really cool because it's a process. Usually, it's a process type practice, and you can feel the power of people's voices being listened to, and also the relevance of art in those contexts. It might be great art, might not be so great art, but it's alive because it's about a relationship and it's about a connection. It could be a connection to a tree, the way you treat a tree and how you receive information from a tree. It doesn't have to be between humans, but I just find that very exciting to think about that without getting all categorical and say this art is better than that art, and it's just like, we're going to go through. There's a Vanessa Andreotti, who is a Brazilian indigenous woman who teaches. She's the dean of education at University of Victoria. She wrote a book called Hospicing Modernity, and she just wrote another short book about artificial intelligence from an indigenous point of view. So there's lots of really interesting reflection going on. She and many others are predicting very difficult times in the future as modernity falls apart, and it already is. The insurance system in the U.S. is on the verge of collapse and that kind of thing. What will we turn to? I've talked about this earlier. I think it'll be art, and I think it'll be localized art. It'll be art where the local storytellers and the local painters and the local take a tremendous importance in society. How are we going to structure that in terms of funding? And I don't know yet. We haven't done that yet. But we do have the legacy of artists who have worked in that way. We've not forgotten their stories, And even opera and other art forms can relate to storytelling, because at one point opera was also a localized art practice in Europe or in other parts of the world. So it's just become so big. It's become an industry, and really what we need is for it to become everyday life. Those artistic connections, and even the word art itself it won't disappear. It'll change. It'll become something else. There's no reason to hang on to that notion of art as such. What's important is what it does, and how we, blah blah blah. Everyone wants to speak now. No.
When you say AI, you do mean artistic intelligence, right?
I also have a really short one. No, I'll pass it along. Something that came to mind when you were talking about like art in culture and in sort of collective gatherings. I don't know if you have all heard of the term collective effervescence. Has anyone heard of that? Okay, I recently learned this term, and I learned it through word of mouth, so please Google it. And also please Google anything I tell you. But basically the idea is sort of like this like collective connection and power that we feel when we are sort of like having voices in number. So like it kind of comes from the idea of like singing in church or in other religious gatherings, where it's like you're like, wow, I feel the power of this. I really believe it, because it's like we're all here together, we're all singing together, and it's that feeling that's like, whoa, that like really amazing feeling. And that has historically played a huge part of religions and other sort of like movements. And I think that that's sort of a concept that we could harness moving forward to try to bring people together and empower them through art, like you were saying, like harnessing the collective and making people feel like they do have power and are part of something bigger than themselves. I don't know. It's just sort of a cool concept. Look it up.
Say again what it's called.
Collective effervescence. Yeah.
Something I just wanted to challenge you on there, Claude, was you mentioned funding. You're like, it's going to happen, if we have the funding. Coming from a place like South Africa where there's a thriving, fantastic, interesting, engaged art community, frequently in places where there is zero funding. So maybe just some reassurance that'll happen anyway. And that is an important conversation to have in Canada as well. I think I'm not saying that it's good that we don't have art funding in South Africa, but art comes up like a weed in the cracks.
Yeah.
And it's not affecting the quality of the art. It's like good art, engaged, amazing, right there, personal, community art. Fantastic stuff, not related at all to funding.
And we're not going to get into a debate about arts funding, let me tell you.
But I wanted to just...
No, it's fine. No.
Anyway, right?
I hear what you're saying. I think this is starting to wrap up because I'm getting tired. I don't know about you, but why don't we just take a few... Like, this is the first one, guys, so thank you so much. It's beyond my expectations, the way that you've talked to each other, and it's really exciting. I think the listeners will enjoy it. And I hope maybe they'll comment and the conversation can continue, especially the new things that we're learning. But why don't we wrap up with just anything that hasn't been said that you want to add? There might not be anything. There might be. I know earlier I wanted to talk about a moment I had of despair around the end of the world as we know it. But I'm not feeling that urge anymore. I think that moment has passed, which is nice, just to let it go. I don't need to say it. It's just past. So does anybody else have anything they want to add before we turn off the machine and call this a success? Yes? I feel like I'm a host now.
Yeah, just to quickly respond to your comment about despair of the world as we know it. Obviously, there is a lot of science and, information about the direction the world is heading. And I think we can assume that things will go badly before they're again good. But I would like to say that, the end of the world as we know it is not necessarily a bad thing. We all know that there are huge systemic problems that are causing the challenges we're facing today. And those things need to be solved. And we need to have a fundamental shift to see them solved. Whether that will happen or whether human race will just fizzle out, who knows? But I'd like to think that change will happen and that it is possible, at least possible, that it could be positive in some way, at least maybe at the end of the day, even if a lot of hardship has to come before then. I don't know if that's hopeful or just sad, but that's my take. Does anyone have anything else?
Maybe just to add to what you said about thinking of artists as midwives, not as death doulas, but it's not hospice care, it's midwives for something else. And we were talking about change earlier. There was recently a post, it was an artwork that someone had put up after the fires, and I think it was in California, and the sign said, "Forced into a great and terrible change." And the word great there is also interesting because it just means big, right? If we take the value of it, the meaning of it, of anything, connotation of it being negative, but a great change sometimes. So